this is the place where it unlocked the rest of our investigation. So we did find this Git string in one of the modules that we could tie back to the botnet, and we knew it was coming from there. So everyone does mistakes, so it's one slip that happened once. But the fact that these binaries were then available for analysis retroactively, then we were able to tie this back. And then we started digging. So what is this organization?
That one rookie mistake became the thread that unraveled one of the largest botnets of its time and took the battle to court. Joining me today to walk us through this incredible pivot from reverse engineering to legal warfare is Pierre-Marc Bureau. Pierre-Marc works at Google's Threat Analysis Group, also known as TAG, where he specializes on identifying, tracking, and countering cyber threats focused on Google, its users, and the broader internet. And now my conversation with Pierre-Marc. Welcome to the podcast, Pierre-Marc. Can you maybe just start giving us a little bit of background on Glupteba? When did it come onto your radar or the radar of TAG? And let's just go from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So Glupteba has been around since 2011, so it's been around for a really long time. I can't tell exactly when we first started talking about this, but I would say that this is almost at the same time as our team started spending more time around botnets, trying to understand how we can better protect users from them, both from their infection, but then even thinking about how botnet operators are monetizing. Is there anything we can do there to reduce the income and reduce the incentives of running big botnets? And as you said, Glupteba has had very high numbers of infected devices for a long time. So that's definitely something that put it up there in our list of priorities. And then one thing that also increased the priority was the fact that it has so many different modules and ways of monetizing. It kind of touches a bit of everything. So that kind of made it really interesting and something where we felt like there was enough complexity there that there might be things that we can do about this, or at least trying to better understand what was going on to see if there was something to be done.
Because the malware itself, building a botnet, so they had to have some form of distribution network. How were they doing that? Did that touch any maybe Google infrastructure ad networks, or were they like leveraging other pay-per-install type service providers?
Yeah, so the actor developing and operating the Glupteba botnet were outsourcing the distribution. I think they might have been doing some of it themselves as well. So they were definitely using services from pay-per-install networks to distribute their malware. So that's definitely something that we've seen in the past. As far as distributing through ads, I don't think this was ever witnessed. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but I'm not aware of any distribution that way. But your typical scenarios of cracked software and websites distributing cracks and that kind of stuff was super popular to distribute pay-per-install network binaries that would then load Glupteba and all kinds of other stuff on there.
And going back to 2011, I mean that they're entering the kind of the prime of the exploit kit. I would imagine those were also likely a big part, and probably where I came across the malware just anecdotally. I looked at a lot of exploit kit incidents in that mid 2000 teens period, so that would make sense. I think those were really, really effective. I went hunting for, before I was with anybody, just on my own, hunting for exploit kits, and I would find just my own way of scraping websites, find them all over the place. So I bet that helped tremendously.
Yeah, absolutely. This distribution was outsourced, so I do remember that there were some exploit kits being used to distribute this. And then you were asking a bit like what was our visibility. Then, of course, some SEO was happening, driving traffic from traffic distribution systems, landing on some of these exploit kits. So that was definitely part of the trend, yeah.
Okay, so then the malware itself, that seems to be a trend with a lot of malware. It's especially commodity stuff. It's multi-tier. It has maybe some major objectives, but data exfiltration, just resilient command and control, all seems to be pretty standard capabilities. Anything else that stood out about what these authors were developing, how they were delivering it? Any unique languages they were using, or evasion and anti-analysis sort of tactics that made them stand up, or were they just really relying on the sheer volume and That seems to be a trade-off that I've observed over the years. If they're more prolific in volume, they can care a little less about how stealthy they really are.
Yeah, or about persistence on the system. If they just have this pipeline of new infections, they care maybe less about staying on infected devices. Um, to me, there were lots of interesting things. One that I think we can come back to later was they were also shipping a crypto miner, and that did help our investigation in figuring out the scale of the infection, but also the kind of revenue that might have been driven to the operators. They were dropping a proxy network, but they were also maintaining their own infrastructure, not only stealing credentials from infected devices, but also by installing a proxy, they could almost rent the access from from an infected device through the stolen and compromised credentials, and then the attacker could come back to the infrastructure they were targeting, let's say a financial institution or Google or Facebook, from the IP of the victim as well. So that's another service that they were selling, which was putting kind of everything end to end, right? You steal the credentials, but you also maintain persistence to traffic network through the infected device. Um, so there were lots of things that ended up being complementary. But in terms of persistence and anti-analysis, I would say that these were average. Like they had a couple of tricks to make sure they were not running into sandboxes, but it was nothing super groundbreaking. And you asked about programming languages and evolution. Um, Jumping ahead, there are still variants of Glupteba being released right now,
Oh,
even
really?
though most of their infrastructure was taken down, or at least right now, in the last couple months. And part of their code has now been rewritten to Go. But in the past, most of the modules were plain C. And once again, you could change one module while not changing the whole thing. So it was evolving over time, probably through different developers as well.
So very modular. C, I'd say, is a pretty common language, and in the last few years, seeing that evolution to Go and Rust. I noticed in some of the reporting. So if anybody's interested, as we're digging into this more and more, Google blogged about some of the activity, some of the initial analysis and findings, and so I'll make sure to add those blogs to the show notes here for the podcast for anyone wants to follow along. There's also we'll get to this in a little bit, but there's also some legal filings, which really added a very interesting element to this. And also those are all publicly available. So
in terms of, I'll interrupt you here for a second.
yeah.
I want to point out that a lot of this analysis was performed by Lutza Nagy, and she presented on the topic at Virus Bulletin in 2022. So I highly recommend everyone looking for technical details to look at the Virus Bulletin proceedings. There is an article there, and she did excellent work on analyzing the binaries and tracking them over time. I've been lucky enough to be involved in the investigation, kind of coordinating different things around it. But Lutza really has a lot of contributions in terms of the analysis, and I highly recommend looking at all our material.
What else did this threat actor have? It seems like they have a kind of an interesting number of fronts, some corporations, and their footprint was, I think, a little bit surprising when I first read, how some of their legal trouble really unfolded. It seems like they had don't.farm, which is where they were selling stolen data, particularly Google and Facebook accounts, likely that they were obviously stealing. They had the AWM proxy and extra card. That looks like where they were selling their proxies and fraudulent credit cards. So this group, if they started in 2011 and it wasn't really till 2020 that they came on, major radars, I mean, they were probably quite confident in how they were operating, and likely making a lot of money. And any additional insight into their activities or uniqueness to how they were approaching evolution in the code? I mean, did they get more sophisticated? It sounds like their major evolution was just going to Go.
Yeah, so that's part of it. Maybe what makes them noteworthy in that area is their commercial sense of having all these front end that were like on the open web. Anybody can go there, and then they were openly sell access through proxy networks or to compromise devices and credentials. So to me, there are not that many actors that are doing that. It's not obvious when you look at AW proxy that they're linked to Glupteba, but when you start looking at how things are working, then it becomes pretty obvious. So I think that's one of the things that really makes them noteworthy is their openness of just like all these services. How can I monetize an infected device or some compromised credentials? And then they pretty much had it all. Farm was really big, and I haven't seen that often that a someone would sell access to compromised credentials, spin up a VM, give you the availability to exit the traffic through the infected device's IP because it also runs a proxy. Like that's an end-to-end service that pretty much anybody can then use without any technical background or expertise. So that is something that makes them noteworthy.
I just always assume that a lot of this activity has to happen in the, what a lot of people just call the dark web, the criminal forums, and you kind of have to go searching and looking, or maybe even be closed access, sort of an invite. And so, yeah, that is pretty brazen to just be out there. I imagine most of that was hosted then on. I mean, is bulletproof hosting the right term in places where they're pretty much guaranteed to have the autonomy and the protection from any sort of international law enforcement to take down their activity? And if they're that brazen and blatant about what they're doing?
That's a good question. I did not see a lot of use of bulletproof hosting. It was mostly just VPS in different countries, different places, and maybe some that were less responsive to abuse notification. But I think they were, maybe for some terms of services, they were operating in this gray area that they're not necessarily, it's not always clear. It's like access an aged account on X service. Like, is it really a compromised account or not? People don't necessarily know. The same for a proxy exit node. In some cases, it might be legit. So I think they were more operating in this gray area that until you connect the dot that this is just monetizing compromised devices, there might be a way to explain that. So that's, I think, how they were avoiding being taken down that much.
So I guess they've been operating for many years. It looks like some of the reporting at the time that Google decided to really take action, well, public action, legal action, millions of devices. Did you have any sense of how, at the peak of this botnet, how large it actually was?
So to the best of our knowledge, the biggest number or the biggest size of the botnet was when it reached around 1 million infected devices. It did fluctuate a lot over time, and after there were legal actions, that number decreased for sure. But as far as I can tell, I don't think it went a lot more than 1 million devices over time.
And composition, was that typically Windows inside somebody's house or a corporation, or did they go IoT and like Linux-based infrastructure?
That's a good question, because at one point we did identify an Android malware that seemed to be related to the same organization. But to the best of our knowledge, there was not a lot of distribution and not many compromised devices through that. A vast majority of the compromised devices were Windows end user devices, probably end users at home and not necessarily in corporations. But as you know, things are now a bit murky. People are using their corporate devices for things at home, and so I'm confident that there were devices that were corporate devices that were compromised as well.
In looking at the reporting, there was a specific string that seems like it cracked the case. get.voltronwork.com. Interestingly enough, voltronwork.com is for sale on as a domain. It's available. I guess we'll get into it a little bit more here in detail, but my understanding is that was a part of the front. So talking about those fronts, that was the company, the entity that they were operating under to give them some sort of a pseudo credibility. But so this URL shows up in a binary. This seems like a rookie mistake. Somebody who's operating a botnet of this scale to leave the string unprotected or even in there at all. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to like what is the string? I think it looks like it was related to maybe a Go package and like where it led you.
Yeah. So to me, this is the part that I find the most fascinating when doing reverse engineering in general. When you start figuring out the humans behind the binaries, or like who is writing this, how are they behaving. This finding is once again from my colleague, not directly from me, but I was around when this happened, and this is the place where it unlocked the rest of our investigation. So we did find this Git string in one of the module, one of the binaries that we could tie back to the botnet, and we knew it was coming from there. So it's definitely one mistake. Everyone does mistakes, so it's one slip that happened once. But the fact that these binaries were then available for analysis retroactively, then we were able to tie this back, and then we started digging. So what's this thing? What is this organization? And then we started finding more and more evidence that were coherent. Like it kind of made sense. Okay, so this seems to be a development shop. They're based in Russia. They have open job postings, so they're hiring folks. And then you start looking at the name, the addresses, and then you find other organizations. One of them was in the US and Delaware. Um, it might be that they're trying to have some part of their business that is on the legitimate side where it's easier to get some income. And then you say, yeah, I'm hiring developers and you're going to be writing a proxy module. And you don't necessarily have the context as to how this proxy is going to be used. So I do wonder if some of the developers in there actually really knew what their code was going to be used for. But yeah, coming back to that discovery is where we're like, okay, we really think we have something here. We knew that this botnet was interesting for everything we've discussed so far, but now we're able to make a connection to some legal organizations, some individuals, and that kind of changed some of the dimensions of our analysis and our investigation. And it led to a bunch of interesting things.
Footprint in Russia, where there looks like they're primarily operating out of. Footprint in Delaware, since Delaware is known for, I believe, strict privacy laws around corporations, and it sounds like they likely did that to gain access to financial capabilities markets and probably funnel money around. And so, but then that footprint in the U.S. Was another slip, perhaps, as it opened the door for the eventual lawsuit to have like a footing and for the U.S. to be able to go after them. Before we get to that, how did this? So up until this point, like we're kind of building up to the legal action that I think ultimately had the biggest impact. What was being done? So like how did their C2 typically work? I know they had resilience in the blockchain, but that sounds like that was a backup. So what was their normal pattern for this malware for checking into the botnet and then being a part of the botnet in terms of this network footprint?
Yep, that's definitely one of the interesting characteristics of Glupteba. Their normal command control protocol was using HTTPS, something that is very common for malware these days. And the address of the command control server was hard coded in the binaries. Typically, a binary would ship with a handful of URLs that they would try and contact to receive commands and then provide feedback on how these commands were executed or what was happening with the infected hosts. But the operators and the developers added a fallback that is poking at the Bitcoin blockchain, looking for the address of a specific wallet and find the latest transaction on that wallet. And from that latest transaction, they can receive a blob that is in the up return of that transaction, decrypt it through AES, and then find another domain. So that's a fallback if all the domains that are all the URLs that are already hard coded in the binary are not responding, or they might be responding but not providing any useful commands, then the fallback would happen. The infected device will reach one of the front end for the blockchains and then receive this information. So that did make the botnet more reliable. Which leads me to wonder, maybe there were cases in the past where all their C2s were down at the same time. I'm not exactly sure why they wanted to do that, but that approach was pretty novel and definitely noteworthy. And it made it hard for us when we were thinking about, like, can we do something against this malware? Can we take it down? Then you have to think about that fallback mechanism, which makes it a lot harder than just seizing a bunch of domains and then everything goes dark.
Their hard-coded domains, those compromised devices, I mean, were they relying on their own botnet then to connect back in? Were they using other compromised websites, or like did they have dedicated systems that they were spinning up to handle those initial connections?
They were
Maybe a
dedicated
little.
systems. They were dedicated systems just being
Okay.
used for command control. Yeah, as far as I can tell, I didn't see any compromised infrastructure in there. So it
Okay.
was compromised devices with a bunch of hard-coded C2 URL reaching out to a server that was under control of the operators.
Okay, well, yeah, and then the blockchain has resilience because if it now a hard coded wallet address, but if all they have to do is post a new transaction with a new encrypted blob until you associate that wallet with bad activity, you don't really know what what it is. Maybe the way that they're interacting with the blockchain stands out. It's a little odd. Easy to then be resilient, right? You figure out what the backup C2 is, and then you try to take that down, and then a new one just pops up. And were the keys then? So AES were the keys also unique, or did they have a way to make it so that it was harder to? Because I'm guessing if they're using one monolithic transaction on one wallet at a time, they have to have the same key in order to take it down. But unless you have the sample and the key, it's just a blob of nonsense.
Yeah, which it was a blob of nonsense. So yeah, you're right. You have to have a pre-shared secret, and there was an AES key that was hard-coded in the binaries. And we actually ended up publishing. You can find that online now. We have a small snippet of Python code that can help anyone decrypt these transactions to figure out what is the domain name that is encoded in them. And in the blog post, there's also, I think, 3 or 4 wallet addresses that you can find, which was one of our approaches. We cannot control that wallet. But if we tell the world where it is and how to decrypt the next command and control server, our hope was that more researchers would be paying attention and potentially taking action really quickly, both either by taking down the domain name or the underlying servers that it points to, the IPs that it points to.
So I guess you come to the realization, and this seems to be the back and forth that I have observed since I started doing cybersecurity myself, is that the adversaries can just stay one step ahead unless you can take a more aggressive approach to go to the source and disrupt. Maybe there's a further spot up the chain. There's the distribution model. There's the people themselves that are behind it. So there's a lot of different opportunities. All of them going to come with their challenges, and especially when you're dealing with international law enforcement, people located in different countries, infrastructure all over the world. I mean, compromised infrastructure. In this case, it sounds like dedicated. What was so you've got the string, you've got these corporate entities, you've got this massive spike in volume. Their botnet is growing. It's affecting Google customers as well as a lot of other and other corporations. When's the pivot point? At what point does the team say we could take further action, and actually do more to disrupt this? I think this is really interesting because it seems like most of us and most corporations are just settled into a very defensive nature. I mean, this feels a little bit of offensive. You're not hacking back, but you're using the courts to be able to help. And this was also a first of its kind, wasn't it? The lawsuit that eventually came out of this.
So the affirmative litigation and taking this to the civil court, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not sure if it's 100% new. I think we all remember that Microsoft has done a lot of lawsuits in the past, so there has been legal action against botnet operators and that kind of stuff. It was the first time on our side, and I feel very lucky and grateful that we had such good teams that were super responsive and interested in helping, especially on the legal side of things, where typically security people don't always like to interact with their legal teams. But in our case, like, they were really awesome and like really, really good, doing really good work. So it was good to engage with them. And then they were like, yeah, we can help you with that. We have ideas. They went out and reached out to some external partners, both to validate all of our results in the legal case, but then also to help with the legal case itself. So to come back to answer your question more clearly, we were like, okay, we have an interesting case. From a technical point of view, there's a bunch of things we can do. From an attribution and understanding the legal organizations and even individuals behind them, we do have an interesting case. So we took that to our legal team, and they were like, yeah, we can help you. We have ideas. And then they really got the ball rolling. And I think the interest was really, can we help users? Can we protect users through different actions, combining legal and technical actions? And can we also tell the world about it? Because sometimes there are these legal actions that are happening and there is not that much visibility happening, or you can just reach out to an ISP and tell them like these things are bad, please take them down, and then you move on. This time there was interest in kind of really coordinating all of that in one operation, which was a bit different and not necessarily our making. It was more of like being at the right place at the right moment. We have all these interesting things, and then our legal team was also like, "Yep, sure, let's do this."
You hear, I mean, I guess when I first got you started in the field, it was kind of, I got a mixed signal attribution. You don't worry about attribution. As a day in day out reverse engineer, I don't oftentimes worry that much about attribution. It's more about capabilities and getting past obfuscations. This was obviously very different, and it just seems like that one simple string was what allowed this. I mean, there are definitely teams, there are Intel teams that attribution is all they do, and it's important to understand that. But maybe for the average security team out there, there's a lot to go into doing that. And then even if you get the attribution, what does that ultimately give you in your day-to-day defenses, unless you're able to do something like what Google was able to do?
Yeah, you're right. There's probably material to speak for hours and hours around attribution. I think, especially around cybercrime, I will care mostly about the TTPs. Are there things that I can put in place to find new activity? What I like to learn about how an operator does his thing, because it does help you be ahead of the curve. You can understand things and you can react more quickly. But when it comes to putting a name or an address or that kind of stuff, I also typically stay really away of that. I don't necessarily care who's writing the malware directly, but understanding their decisions, their trade-offs, that I think is super interesting. But of
Okay.
course, there are some cases where, in this case, we had help from different parts of the company that helped with the investigation, and then it kind of helped having an attribution to a company that we could then do more about. So, I would say might be an exception to the rule, where it's like in some cases it does help.
Okay, so we're talking about Glupteba and this massive botnet that built up 2011 into the early 2020-ish. Google filed a complaint secretly on December 2nd, 2021. That's now public, and you can go look at the filing. So there, we've talked a lot about what was the botnet, what was the capability, what was sort of the purpose, the corporate structure, or the business structure, the fronts that they were using. Maybe we could now turn to the actual like the court case and why. What was the ultimate objective with filing? Was there any strategy? It looks like it was filed in the Southern District of New York. Was there any that you can speak to? I know I'm not a lawyer either, but I have access to AI, so it's kind of like I slept in a Holiday Inn last night. Well, I have Gemini at my side. Is there any specific strategy to that? Or, I mean, it looks like ultimately the goal was to go after the C2 servers, because what could you do to the blockchain? So is this really still like the same effort of whack-a-mole, but just applied in a legal sense? Or so, yeah. Can you walk us through what was going on
Yeah.
there, and what was the thoughts with moving into the legal sphere here?
I like the way you put it, of like, is this continuing the whack-a-mole but with lawyers now? So the strategy was first to expose this operation and bring attention to it, which, like, the legal filing is 40 plus pages and it's full of details. It's super interesting, and I had never seen such a thing before. And the idea was to bring that in front of a judge and then have the judge say, yes, this is bad. This is bad against Google and bad against Google users, and ask for the domains to be taken down, domains and infrastructure. And then with that ruling, we were able to go to ISPs and providers globally, in France and Germany, amongst others, and tell them, look, this has gone in front of a judge in New York. Please help us by taking all of this infrastructure down at the same time. So the strategy was first to expose and then to be able to take down the infrastructure all at once. And then lastly, by going public with the whole thing, as I mentioned before, the things that could not be easily taken down, like the Bitcoin wallets, at least put them, illuminate them, point everyone at them, like anyone who cares. Maybe that's not that many people out there, but at least saying like these are the things you can look at. They're the ones that are hard coded in the binaries. Here's how you can decrypt the content and find any new domain as they are released. And the final objective was really to make the whole thing stop, reduce the number of compromised users, compromised accounts, compromised devices being used as proxy endpoints or to mine crypto for someone else.
And this was a civil suit, so
Correct.
it was not meant to ultimately go after the arrest of these individuals, but just to bring light, as you just discussed. So civil suit, pay for the damages, and then surface this whole operation. Coordinated law enforcement. So it sounds like there was a lot of coordination then with international law enforcement, and then all these. So this must have been a massive undertaking to get everybody quietly on the same page. I'm guessing you picked a day or maybe a period of time that you would all hit that kill switch and take the infrastructure down and kill the domains.
Yeah. For the infrastructure takedown, this was actually also mostly civil, and there were not that many other organizations, law enforcement organizations globally being involved. We picked the date in sync or to synchronize with our legal teams that were doing the court filings, and that part was the one that we depended on. So when we had confidence that this was going to become public, then we had everything lined up. And to make a small parenthesis, uh, getting all of that material lined up, I had to ask many of my colleagues, like, please review all my notes. I have this 40-page long document that's going to be signed by a director, that's going to be put in front of a judge. If there's a mistake in there, the consequences can be very serious, and it's been a very stressful time for all of the team, because you're going through all of this and you're like, okay, this is not just me writing a small report for my colleagues. This is something that's going to get scrutiny, legal scrutiny as well, and the consequences of having something, having a mistake in the data and the attribution and everything is very significant.
Yeah, I bet. I typed voltronwork.net instead of .com, and now we're after the wrong,
Right.
the wrong people. From the Google reporting, the public reporting, a 78% reduction in botnet infections. Does that sound about accurate?
Yes. Yeah, it does sound accurate. Of course, it always fluctuates, and we did discuss previously that there are still new variants being rolled out. So, of course, ideally, I would like the threat to be completely gone, and then we can move to something else. But there is still some activity, and there are still some devices that are impacted, but the volume has gone down significantly.
Yeah.
And I wonder how just these organizations being named, and then the fact that people in the cybercrime ecosystem know that this group is receiving scrutiny. Maybe it makes them a bit less attractive to work with. Maybe they lost some partners, and it's not necessarily just the number of infected devices that matters, but also, are they still able to monetize to the same extent? Are they as seen as reliable anymore?
Yeah, because there's been some interesting cases over the years of internal criminal group chat logs being dropped, and all the kind of the backstabbing and stuff that they do. Certainly, they're their own unique ecosystem, but a lot of just what we deal with on a regular basis. Reputation has its risks, and I don't know what this impact this had on seeing later, where we saw more arresting of people. The coordination of Emotet seemed to be one that stands out in my mind more recently. Some of the ransomware gangs that I can't think of the names now, but we saw there seemed to be this period where they ran with impunity. You would try to take down an infrastructure and disrupt, and maybe block at the endpoint, but there was never any legal action. And now we're in this area where there seems to be legal action, which doesn't always seem to end the threat, though. They seem to eventually find their way, in some cases, back to operations.
Like most things, sorry for interrupting. Like most things in security, I think we're really looking at raising the bar, or either making it less profitable to do bad things or making it harder to do bad things. It's very rare that you have like a complete results that are like, this went from 100% to zero and let's move on.
Yeah. Well, they're just it's fascinating. If you set aside the intent of some of these groups, what they do I mean, I've worked for companies where it's hard enough to develop and release software doing it all legitimately. They're out there operating in the dark edges of the internet, and so I guess sometimes just right there in front of our faces. That it's still it's just very interesting that they're able to, and it just shows how how complex the system really is and how difficult these challenges are to understand. I mean, like, what network admin, what security person can say with confidence at the end of any day that they know 100% what's going on in their networks and on their systems? It's yeah, you can't. I say that as a reverse engineer. Like, how many times do I look at a binary that I can tell you with 100% confidence I know everything that it's doing? I very rarely can, because it's just, there's typically too much there to uncover and unravel, and that's just one program.
Mhm.
Okay, so the legal stuff is where I was begin. Just an interesting side of this whole story, the blockchain. Then, so basically the blockchain is what left them with the resilience they needed to stay up and running. So that's probably what saved them ultimately, and allowed them to continue. And it sounds, I was surprised to hear that they're still operating today.
Correct. I don't think that they are using the blockchain anymore. But yes, and as we said, this is being distributed through different means. So I, I'm not sure if it is 20% of the million infected devices that remain the same, rather than they kept doing things and then they paid more people to get more installs through pay-per-install networks. But yeah, there has been cases where they tried to push a new domain through the blockchain, and then some hosts probably managed to get updated with new C2 URLs and new infrastructure that was not part of the initial litigation and investigation.
So back to the legal stuff. The initial suit was filed in 2021. It looks like the clerk entered a default because the defendants didn't show up. That's probably not a surprise at this point.
Yeah. But what was a surprise is that they actually hired a lawyer in New York. And that lawyer came to the court and to represent them. And they were like, yeah, we're going to be taking part in this trial. And then the judge said, well, can you please come to the United States so that you can come in front of the judge? And they were like, oh, we don't really have a passport. And then there were all these back and forth, which was surreal to me. I thought that we would never hear about these people that were being named, and that would be the end of it.
Two individuals, so you likely came to them through that string that allowed you to start to connect the corporations and all of that. It looks like in March of 22, they hired their lawyer. They filed a motion to vacate. So they're actually engaging in the legal process. April of that same year, Judge Coate grants their motion, so that allows the case to proceed. This is another, I think, really interesting twist to this whole thing. So now they've shown up. They say they've hired an attorney. They want to fight this out in the courts with Google of all places. What happens next?
I don't have all the details. Some of them are private. But what happened in the end is that the the judge completely dismissed the case, and they even blamed the defendant for trying to extort the other party, the other lawyers, and they asked the lawyer that they took to refund some of the legal fees up to $250,000. And this is, once again, this is public. So some of the discussions were found by the judge to be either, I want to say, unethical or not honest. And then in the end, the judge was like, okay, that's enough. Or at least that's my understanding of this. There are probably some nicer legal terms to it, but it's like, okay, that's enough. You're not being honest in front of the judge. You're making everybody waste time. You tried to extort the other party. Here's the conclusion of it. You need to pay $250,000 back in legal fees. So that was unexpected and very interesting to see happen. Once again, I invite you to look at the different proceedings that are public. And it's super interesting.
It's these two people that were named. I'm not even going to try to pronounce their names. They decide to sue. Google asks for laptops. They say we don't have them, and that they were fired from this company that they worked for, and it was the CEO that probably is made up at this point. So they don't have any. They tried to negotiate then and basically extort, saying that we will give you the private keys. I'm assuming for the C2s that they've been dropping into the binaries and into the blockchain. But you have to pay. Google has to pay us $1 million each defendant, and then our attorney gets like $100,000. I think the idea behind that was they wanted to further the discovery process to try to gain more insight into how Google was operating and detecting. So it's almost like they showed up just to troll Google in this into this court battle. Is this? Did I interpret all that correctly?
I think so. I don't see many other conclusions that we can reach. Maybe they were trying to gain time or just make things last longer so that people would get tired of this, or I'm not sure exactly what else they would have been wanting to do in this context. But yeah, super surprising, very surprising.
Google rejects their offer, and I think then that went down the path that you were talking about, and that the judge said this is extortion, and you're not here in good faith. And not only I don't remember what the judgment was, because there is also the judgments now, of course, in the public court records. It looks like fine the defendants and also fine the attorney, which is I think what you mentioned just a few moments ago. So really ending conclusion to the legal saga of this whole the Glupteba takedown.
Yeah, and this whole thing went on for a year. Like this was happening over a long period of time. But yes, the defending lawyer had to pay because I guess if you send the bill to the folks in Russia, they probably don't really have to pay it back. So
yeah, I was curious about that. I just assumed that the ruling basically the attorney that was U.S. based probably had some money to cough up, but I would imagine the defendants are in areas where there's just no way to enforce that. Again, in a way, a happy ending. In a way, as we talked about, maybe not as satisfying because you can just never get to 100%. What else did you learn about tracking adversaries, about trying to be more effective at takedowns and dealing with this resilience? Is this still a common pattern that we see with how malware is distributed? There doesn't seem to be a family name or a group that has dominated in recent times, at least not that I'm aware of, like the Emotets and maybe the Gluptebas. Is that a result of some of these combined actions? Is it something else going on? Are they just stealthier and we're just not aware, or we're not tracking them as effectively? Or do you have any thoughts on how this all kind of ties together and leads us to our current state?
yeah, that's a good question. I share the same observation that there are fewer big players that are really out there, visible and known to everyone. So I think it does show that some of the, especially law enforcement operations against the big brands of malware operators did work, and it's probably harder or riskier for malware operators to reach this level of being known worldwide. Um, for me and the team, this was the first time we did an affirmative litigation, but then Google has continued to do affirmative litigations afterwards. There was an affirmative litigation against a traffic distribution system that was distributing CryptBot, and there has been more recent one against phishing infrastructure. So I think some of the legal civil lawsuits is something that continues. I think it has some value in the sense that, as we discussed before, it will expose some of these players, probably make their jobs a bit harder, while at the same time making it easier to take down some of the infrastructure. So that's one thing that I think will continue. It's always, each case is a bit different, but it is still relevant. Another thing that I learned through this whole thing is having a good network of contact really helps. Building your network of who do you know in ISPs, at other software providers and other places. You never know when it might make things much easier to call someone that you know when you need help, rather than trying to find them at the last minute. So when we think about taking down infrastructure, that's definitely one of the things that does help.
You didn't just go to social media and say, hey, could anyone from ISPX reach out to me? I need some help from coordinating some takedowns.
Yeah, exactly. And then very often their abuse at email addresses are a bit swamped with requests, so they don't necessarily get to yours really quickly. So yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, I would echo that. I would say I've never been involved in something like what you've been involved with here, but that network of people to reach out to and having places to go to, even to ask, and like the some of the trust groups that I've been able to participate in and see this value. I don't know how often folks out there get to experience that or are a part of that. I mean, they're closed groups for a reason, a lot of reasons, but they can be incredibly powerful, not just for career growth and finding jobs, but for what we're talking about here. Like what happens when you need to reach out to 17 ISP. I don't know how many numbers were involved, but across the globe, that requires a pretty massive Rolodex or network contact book. I don't know if Rolodex that's a pretty dated term. I grew up with dial phones too. I mean, I was probably on the end of that era, but so yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were had something else to finish there.
No, I think this is all good. Yeah, I was talking about the having a good network of people to work with, and then yeah, even internally, like the different teams that we were working with, that also really helped combining the legal knowledge. And I can't say it enough. Working with all our lawyers was really awesome. Just the questions that we get asked, and then working together to like, how would I formulate this knowledge about the command and control protocol and a C2 server, and then phrasing that in a way that makes its way to court is a different set of knowledge than reverse engineering the protocol, but then like combining all of this together and then using that to go and reach out to other organizations for takedown, I think was super fascinating. And that's one of the things that I learned, just putting all these kind of skills together and expertise together really can yield some interesting things.
Yeah, the communication. Communicate what you find. Translating some very technical things. I mean, maybe a string like get.voltronwork.com is a little more self-explanatory, but I suppose to someone who sometimes when you take a step back and you say, well, it's just a string, and they go, what's a string? I go, well, how do I even start? That's such a simple thing that I've taken for granted now for so long. How do I stop and really explain what that represents to somebody who doesn't understand? Well, it's a sequence of bytes. Well, what's a byte? Well, why does it matter? Well, they need to use it to connect to an IP address. What's an IP? It opens up this whole rabbit hole of translation that someone has to be able to grasp. And attorneys tend to be smart people, but it's not always very obvious.
Yeah. And another organization we collaborated with was a cryptocurrency investigation firm. And that also opened a whole area that I was not very familiar with. And then talking with them, and they were actually able to replicate some of our findings and confirm some of the things that we had. But the way they were explaining it and their reasoning, and I was like, wow, this is something that I'm not familiar with. I'm really out of my comfort zone. Um, so it still comes from a binary. You still find this wallet address in the binary, but then it goes into really weird areas.
I'm curious a little bit, a lot bit actually, about the composition of their quote unquote company. I mean, there seems to be two names that were named in the law. Well, there doesn't seem to be. There was two names in the lawsuit. It seems like then these are the two people that were really in charge of this whole operation, and they were just bringing in more or less contractors to help write some of the code. I guess that also is not an uncommon model, even to this day, to farm that out. I suppose AI is going to take over a little bit of that work, and I would imagine we're going to get a lot of really bad malware for a period of time. But I don't know if that's anything really all that interesting about that part of the botnet operations.
So I think when we think about this now, it's not that surprising to see this kind of structure of an organization, because we've seen some ransomware groups that were operating also with very structured organizations with sub teams focusing on different parts of their mission. But 5 years ago, when we released this investigation, this was a bit newer and this was something that was less common. So the legal team did put a bit more emphasis on that organization, the fact that they were really operating as a company with different titles and recruitment and that kind of stuff. But that was probably one of the first well-documented cases that then ended up being seen again in other groups that were doing other types of cybercrime. But yeah, I think Yeah, I think that some of the developers that were in there probably didn't know exactly how their software was being used, but some of the leaders definitely were putting everything together, and they knew exactly what they were doing.
I could see that then being surprising. You get this. It's hard to get a peek into how a lot of these groups are operating, and then you finally do get a peek, and my assumption would have been more loose knit, folks operating just out of their houses or locations, whatever. Not even if was somewhat fake, but not a real organized structure. And I think that was also that continued to surprise me, being just a sort of tertiarily involved with peeking behind. Again, as an RE, I don't tend to get into the attribution. I don't tend to have to go tracking and understand the operators all that much and how they're operating and what are their TTPs. And so it's always a little surprising to me when you see these robust corporate structures and recruitments. They're placing ads, legitimate ads. They're trying to draw a certain legitimacy to what they're doing for the development work. And so yeah, I could see that was probably pretty surprising. Did it change the way that, I mean, other than the legal battle, did it really change the way that you approached analyzing them? They obviously were successful in building a large botnet, but I would imagine like inconsistencies in their code base, and if they have people coming and going, the core capability might be there, but stylistic changes that you might have relied upon for sample attribution and similarity might have been harder to track.
Yeah, 100%. When you start seeing these malware families that have half a dozen different modules, and then you realize, oh yeah, they probably like they're all used for the same thing, but they're probably not written by the same people, and you can get a feeling of that based on the algorithms that they use or the coding style that they use, the mistakes that they do. So yeah, I would say that this probably opened the door to that thinking. When I'm analyzing a new threat, then it's like definitely a possibility that this was not done by one person and probably not operated by the same person. And I do realize that more and more I use the term ecosystems rather than one malware author, because I do see that the delivery of the malware is probably done by one part of the ecosystem, and then the persistence or the monetization will be different modules that are probably done by the different things. You probably see the same as I do, that we often see malware now that has no persistence. It just cannot survive a reboot. And you're like, what's happening? Why aren't you persisting? Is it just to evade detection, or is it because there's another dropper up there that is responsible for that part, that's probably written and operated by someone else but can still do it? So yeah, I'm thinking more and more about malware as modular things for different missions, rather than the maybe older malware families that would do everything, that would be clearly coded by the same person.
Yeah, I definitely see in the same trends. And I was recently putting together some basic malware analysis content, and I had the slide from years ago, and I think it's covered in the practical malware analysis book too. You've got your rootkits, and you got your Trojans, and you've got and all the basic terms of viruses, and all these basic terms that we've grown up with, I guess, and they get used in the media. Like, it just felt so meaningless. I mean, everything's so modular, and you kind of have to treat now. I mean, yes, it might. Ransomware might just only ransom, but then it also does data exfil that doesn't maybe persist, but it could persist, and everything just seems to have sort of all of the capabilities until you go in and confirm that it doesn't. So thank you, Pierre-Marc, for taking the time to join the podcast today and for talking about this. Really, really interesting, and congratulations on seeing a successful end to this whole chain. I would imagine that the years of work and effort felt like it really paid off. So thanks again, and I'll give you any last thoughts or comments.
No, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. Just want to reiterate once more that this is really a team effort. So I'm glad to be able to talk about this and shed light on what was done, but I have a very small portion of contribution there. Lutza did great work, and lots of other contributors did. So shout out to them.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much. And that's all for this episode of Behind the Binary. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It really helps us to reach new listeners. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring.